10 years of marriage. A milestone I thought we'd celebrate with joy, reminiscing about everything we'd built together. Emily and I had created a life I was proud of, 2 kids, a home that felt like a sanctuary, and a bond that I thought could weather anything. But now, looking back, I can see the cracks had been forming for a while. I just hadn't wanted to notice them. Trust isn't something you can take for granted. It's built slowly, through years of shared moments, and can be destroyed in an instant. I didn't know it then, but the foundation I thought was unshakable had already started to crumble. It wasn't one big event that made me question things. It was the small, almost imperceptible changes. At first, they were easy to dismiss. Emily had always been affectionate, the kind of person who would kiss me on the cheek when I walked through the door or lean against me on the couch while we watched TV. But those little gestures started to fade. I'd lean in for a kiss, and she'd turn her head slightly, offering her cheek instead. When we sat on the couch, she'd sit at the far end, her phone in her hand, her attention elsewhere. I told myself she was just tired, that life had been wearing her down. But the excuses started piling up, and with each one, the distance between us grew. Her phone became her constant companion. She used to leave it lying around the house, forgotten on the kitchen counter, or buried under a pile of laundry. But now it was always with her, clutched in her hand, tucked into her pocket, or face down on the table. I'd hear the soft ping of a notification and glance over, only to see her quickly swipe it away. "Just work," she'd say when I asked about it. But the smile she gave me felt forced, and the way her fingers lingered on the screen made my stomach tighten. I wanted to believe her, but the unease in my chest wouldn't go away. Then there were the nights out. They started off innocently enough. She'd mention going out with her coworkers for a drink, or meeting a friend who needed some advice. I didn't think much of it. She deserved to have her own time, just like I did. But the nights out became more frequent. Her explanations started to feel rehearsed, and I noticed how much effort she was putting into her appearance before she left. She'd stand in front of the mirror, adjusting her dress or applying a final coat of lipstick, looking at herself with a critical eye. "You look nice," I'd say, trying to sound casual. "Thanks," she'd reply, her smile warm but distant. "Don't wait up, okay? It might be a late one." I'd nod, forcing a smile of my own, but the knot in my stomach would only tighten. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday evening. Emily had left for another work dinner, and the kids were already in bed. I was tidying up the kitchen when I noticed her phone on the counter. She'd forgotten it, something she almost never did. As I reached for it, my hand shook slightly. I wasn't the kind of person who went through someone else's phone. In 10 years of marriage, I'd never even considered it. But something in the back of my mind told me I needed to know. The screen lit up as I touched it, displaying a notification from someone named David. My breath caught as I read the message. "Can't wait to see you tonight. You looked amazing last time." My chest tightened, and the phone felt heavy in my hand. I stared at the screen, my mind racing with questions. Who was David? Why hadn't she mentioned him before? And what did he mean by last time? The message was innocent enough on the surface, but the context, combined with everything else, painted a different picture. I didn't scroll through her phone, didn't search for more messages. I set it back on the counter, my hands trembling as I tried to think. I told myself there could be an explanation, that I didn't know the full story. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and I couldn't ignore it. When Emily came home that night, I was still sitting at the kitchen table, her phone untouched beside me. She looked surprised to see me awake, her smile faltering for just a moment before she recovered. "What are you doing up?" she asked, her tone light. "Couldn't sleep," I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. She nodded, crossing the room to pick up her phone. Her fingers brushed against it, and I saw the flicker of recognition in her eyes when she noticed the notification. She slipped the phone into her pocket quickly, avoiding my gaze. "You should get some rest," she said, her voice soft. "It's late." "Emily," I said, stopping her as she turned to leave. She paused, looking back at me, her expression carefully neutral. "Yeah." I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. I wanted to ask her about the message, about David, about the nights out and the sudden distance between us. But I wasn't ready for the answers. "Nothing," I said finally. "Good night." She smiled again, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Good night, Luke." As she disappeared up the stairs, I sat there in the silence, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on me. The next day, the unease lingered like a storm cloud I couldn't escape. Emily moved around the house with her usual grace, smiling at the kids as she packed their lunches and tied her hair back in a messy bun. To anyone else, she looked like the perfect wife and mother. But to me, every smile she flashed felt rehearsed, every laugh forced. I couldn't stop staring at her phone, which sat casually on the counter while she flitted about the kitchen. She didn't seem to notice how my eyes lingered on it, or if she did, she didn't let it show. My mind was a storm of questions. Who was David? What did his message mean? How far had things gone? The knot in my stomach grew tighter every time she picked up her phone and swiped at the screen, her smile soft but unreadable. The kids were finally loaded into the car, their cheerful chatter echoing through the garage as Emily grabbed her bag and kissed me on the cheek. "Don't forget to take out the trash," she said lightly, her tone breezy, as if nothing had changed. I nodded, my chest tight as I watched her pull out of the driveway. The moment she was gone, the house felt unbearably quiet. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the spot where her phone had rested, the weight of my suspicions pressing down on me like a boulder. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was going on, and I needed answers. That evening, as Emily cooked dinner, I tried to act normal, but the tension between us was impossible to ignore. I asked her about her day, watching her closely as she gave me the usual vague answers. "Work was fine," she said, stirring a pot on the stove. "Nothing exciting." Her voice was steady, but I noticed the way her hands tightened on the wooden spoon, the subtle shift in her posture as if she were bracing herself. "What about you?" she asked, glancing over her shoulder. "Anything interesting happen today?" "Not much," I replied, keeping my tone casual. "Just the usual." She nodded, her focus returning to the stove, but I saw the flicker of relief in her expression. That night, I waited until she was asleep before I made my move. Her phone was on the nightstand, charging as it always was. My heart pounded as I reached for it, my hands shaking as I unlocked the screen. Her passcode hadn't changed, something I hadn't expected but was grateful for. The first thing I checked was her messages. I scrolled past the usual conversations, group chats with friends, reminders from work, until I found his name. David. My breath caught as I opened the thread, my stomach twisting with every word I read. "Last night was incredible. I can't stop thinking about you. I loved seeing you in that dress. You looked stunning." My chest tightened as I scrolled further, each message like a dagger to my heart. The casual familiarity between them, the way he spoke to her like they shared something intimate, was enough to make my blood boil. But it wasn't just the words. There were pictures too. Selfies of Emily, smiling in ways I hadn't seen in months, her eyes bright and playful. She was wearing the dress she'd left the house in last Thursday, the same one she hadn't bothered to mention was new. My hands trembled as I set the phone down, my mind racing with questions. How could she do this? How long had it been going on? And why hadn't I seen it sooner? The next day, I couldn't bring myself to look at her. Every time she spoke, her voice felt like a lie, every touch a betrayal. I knew I couldn't confront her yet, not until I had more. I needed proof, something undeniable, something she couldn't talk her way out of. Over the next few days, I began to watch her more closely. I kept track of her schedule, noting the days she left early or came home late. I paid attention to the way she dressed, the effort she put into her appearance when she said she was going to work or meeting a friend. And I checked her phone whenever I could, scrolling through her messages and piecing together the story she hadn't told me. It all pointed to one thing. She was meeting him, David, a man I didn't know, but who seemed to know my wife better than I did. The final straw came on Friday. Emily left the house around noon, saying she was running errands. She kissed me on the cheek as she left, her smile warm but hollow. "I won't be long," she said, grabbing her bag and heading out the door. My stomach churned as I watched her drive away, her car disappearing down the street. I waited for a few minutes before grabbing my keys and following her. She drove across town, her route winding through neighborhoods we didn't usually visit. My heart pounded as I kept my distance, trying to stay out of sight while keeping her car in view. Finally, she pulled into the parking lot of a small cafe, a place I'd never seen her go before. My breath caught as I saw him. David. He was already there, standing by the entrance, his hands in his pockets as he scanned the lot. Emily parked her car and got out, walking toward him with a smile that felt like a knife to my chest. He stepped forward, his posture casual, and placed a hand on her lower back as they walked inside. I parked a safe distance away, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I tried to steady my breathing. My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Who was he? How long had this been going on? And what the hell was I going to do about it? I sat there for what felt like hours, watching the cafe from my car, my chest tight with anger and disbelief. When they finally came out, they were laughing, their heads close together as they walked toward his car. Emily glanced over her shoulder once, her expression relaxed, and for a moment, I thought she saw me. But she didn't stop, didn't hesitate. David opened the passenger door for her, and she slid inside without a second thought. I followed them as they drove out of the lot, my heart pounding as I gripped the steering wheel. This wasn't just an affair. It was something deeper, something calculated, and I was going to find out exactly what it was. The next morning, I could barely look at Emily. Her cheerful demeanor as she made coffee and packed lunches felt like a performance. Each smile she flashed like salt in an open wound. My mind was consumed by what I had seen the day before, by the messages, the cafe, and the way she had so effortlessly walked into another man's car. David. Even thinking his name made my stomach churn. I couldn't shake the image of them laughing together, their bodies close as though they had no care in the world. But what haunted me the most was the question of how far this betrayal had gone and what I hadn't yet uncovered. That evening, while we sat across from each other at dinner, Emily's phone buzzed on the table. She quickly silenced it, her fingers moving a little too fast as she flipped the phone over. My heart raced as I watched her, trying to appear casual, but my nerves were on edge. "Who's that?" I asked, my voice calm despite the tension in my chest. She didn't even look up as she answered, "Just work." Her tone was light, breezy, but I noticed how her hands tensed slightly, her movements a little too deliberate. After dinner, she excused herself to shower, leaving her phone unattended for the first time in days. I didn't hesitate. Grabbing the device, I unlocked it with the code I now knew by heart and opened her messages. There it was, right at the top. David. His message was short but gut-wrenching. "Meet me tonight at the cottage. 9 p.m. I'll be waiting." Emily's reply was just as devastating. "I'll be there. Can't wait." My chest tightened as I stared at the screen, my breathing shallow. I didn't even notice her coming back into the room until her voice startled me. "What are you doing with my phone?" she asked, her tone sharp, her eyes narrowing as she walked toward me. I scrambled for an excuse, setting the phone down quickly. It was buzzing nonstop. I just checked to make sure it wasn't urgent. Her gaze lingered on me, suspicion flickering in her eyes, but she didn't push the issue. "Next time, just leave it alone," she said, her voice cold as she grabbed the phone and walked away. I sat there, my mind racing. I didn't know where this cottage was, but I was going to find out. I wasn't going to let this slip through my fingers. At 8:30 that evening, Emily emerged from the bedroom, dressed in a simple black dress that clung to her in a way that made my stomach churn. She didn't bother with excuses this time, just said, "I'm going out for a little while. Don't wait up." Her voice was casual, but I could see the way she avoided my eyes, the way she lingered at the door like she was waiting for me to question her. I didn't. I just nodded, watching her leave, my jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. As soon as she was gone, I grabbed my keys and followed her. Keeping a safe distance, I tailed her car through the city streets, my heart pounding in my chest with every turn. She headed out of town, the lights fading as the road became narrower and darker. My headlights barely illuminated the path ahead as we drove deeper into the countryside. Finally, she turned down a dirt road, her car disappearing behind a line of trees. I followed cautiously, my breath catching as I saw the outline of an old, weathered house come into view. The place looked abandoned, its paint peeling, windows boarded up, and overgrown weeds surrounding the property. This was no romantic getaway. This was something else entirely. Emily parked her car and stepped out, her movements quick and deliberate as she walked toward the house. I parked a safe distance away, my heart pounding as I crept closer, staying low and hidden in the shadows. The house loomed ahead of me, its silhouette ominous against the night sky. I watched as she knocked on the door, the sound echoing faintly in the stillness. A moment later, it opened, and David stepped out. He smiled at her, his posture relaxed as he gestured for her to come inside. My chest tightened as I watched her disappear through the door, my mind racing with possibilities. What was she doing here? And why had she agreed to meet him in such a place? I crept closer, my footsteps silent on the dirt, until I reached one of the side windows. Peering through a crack in the boarded-up frame, I caught a glimpse of the interior. The room was dimly lit, the furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. But as I watched, David led Emily toward a door at the back of the house, a door that seemed oddly out of place in the decrepit setting. They disappeared inside, and I quickly moved to the side of the house, finding another window that gave me a view of the secret room. My breath caught as I saw what was inside. The room was a stark contrast to the rest of the house. It was luxurious, almost opulent, with soft lighting, plush furniture, and a fully stocked bar. The walls were lined with mirrors, and in the center of the room was a large, intricately designed bed draped in silk sheets. It looked like something out of a fantasy, completely at odds with the abandoned house surrounding it. My stomach churned as I watched Emily laugh softly. Her body language relaxed as David poured her a drink. For a moment, I felt frozen, unable to process what I was seeing. But then the door opened again, and two more men entered. They were strangers, men I'd never seen before, their smiles easy and confident as they approached her. My heart pounded as I watched them, their movements deliberate as they closed the distance between themselves and my wife. One of them reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering a little too long. The other placed a hand on her waist, his touch possessive and intimate. Emily didn't pull away. Instead, she smiled, her laugh soft and inviting as she leaned into their touch. My chest felt like it was about to explode as I watched, my mind racing with a mix of anger, disbelief, and betrayal. This wasn't just an affair. This was something else entirely, something I couldn't even begin to comprehend. I stayed there, hidden in the shadows, my hands trembling as I gripped the edge of the windowsill. Every instinct screamed at me to burst through the door, to confront them, to demand answers. But I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was watch as my world fell apart before my eyes. As I peered into the secret room, my entire world crumbled before my eyes. Emily wasn't just comfortable there. It was as if she belonged. The way her touch lingered on their arms, her laughter light and genuine, and the casual grace of her gestures showed this wasn't the first time she had been in that room. The opulence, the rich decor, and the lavish furniture clashed with the crumbling exterior of the house, making the situation feel even more surreal. She reached for the drink David offered her, their fingers brushing briefly, and she inclined her head, smiling at him with a warmth that used to only be mine. This wasn't a quick fling or a brief lapse in judgment. This was something planned, something deeper, and something she clearly enjoyed. It was impossible to believe how far this betrayal had gone. I wanted to storm into the room. I wanted to shout, to confront them all, to make them see what they had done to me, to my family. But as I gripped the windowsill, I realized that wouldn't solve anything. My anger would only escalate the situation, and I didn't know what kind of people I was dealing with. These men, David especially, carried themselves with an air of control, as if they were used to getting what they wanted. The way he stood there, watching Emily like he owned her, made my stomach churn. I knew then that this wasn't just about Emily and me. This was something much bigger. I backed away from the window, my hands shaking as I pulled out my phone. There was only one person I could call, Detective Paul Richards. He and I had been friends for years, and though we weren't as close as we used to be, I knew I could trust him. He answered on the second ring, his voice calm but alert. "Luke? What's going on?" he asked. I struggled to find the words at first, my voice trembling as I explained everything I had seen. The luxurious room, Emily, David, and the two other men who had been touching her. Paul listened in silence, but when he spoke, his tone was sharp and decisive. "Give me the address," he said. "Stay where you are, and don't go inside. Let us handle this." I rattled off the location, my words coming quickly as I described the abandoned house and its hidden interior. Paul assured me a team was on the way and told me to stay out of sight. "We'll take care of it, Luke. Just hold tight." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me, and hung up the phone. The minutes that followed felt like hours. Every second stretched on, the tension building as I imagined what might be happening inside that room. The laughter continued, muffled but clear enough to twist the knife deeper in my chest. I tried to steady my breathing, but my heart was racing, my mind spinning with questions and anger. How long had this been going on? How had I missed it? And what kind of person had Emily become? Finally, in the distance, I heard the faint wail of sirens. Relief washed over me, though it was quickly replaced by a new wave of anxiety. This was it. This was the moment everything would come crashing down. As the sirens grew louder, the flashing lights of the police cars illuminated the yard, bathing the old house in a surreal glow of red and blue. Officers poured out of their vehicles, their movements swift and precise as they surrounded the property. I stayed hidden in the shadows, my breath catching as they shouted commands and stormed through the front door. For a moment, there was nothing but chaos. Voices yelling, heavy footsteps echoing inside, and the sound of furniture being moved or knocked over. Then, one by one, they began to emerge. David was the first. He was led out in handcuffs, his expression a mix of anger and defiance. His eyes darted around, calculating, as if he was already planning his next move. The other two men followed, their heads down, their bodies stiff as the officers escorted them to the waiting cars. Finally, Emily appeared. She walked between two officers, her face pale but composed. There was no panic in her expression, no shame. She looked calm, almost detached, as if she had already accepted her fate. For the briefest moment, her eyes met mine. I searched her face for something, remorse, regret, anything, but there was nothing there. Just a hollow resignation that made my stomach turn. As the police cars pulled away, the sirens fading into the distance, I stood there in the dark, numb to everything around me. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I had loved and trusted, was gone. In her place was a stranger, someone capable of betraying me in ways I could never have imagined. But as painful as the truth was, I knew it was better than the lies I had been living with. At least now I could begin to rebuild, to take back control of my life and protect my children from whatever darkness Emily had brought into our family. The day after the arrests, I woke up to an unfamiliar silence in the house. Emily wasn't there to hum softly in the kitchen while making coffee or call out to the kids to hurry with their shoes before school. For the first time in years, her absence wasn't temporary. She wasn't coming back. The kids, thankfully, were too young to grasp the gravity of what had happened. All they knew was that Mommy wasn't home, and Daddy was suddenly much quieter. I told them she had gone away for a while to sort some things out, a vague explanation that seemed to satisfy their curiosity. But for me, there were no vague answers, no comforting half-truths, only the stark reality of what she'd done and the wreckage she'd left behind. Paul called later that afternoon. His tone was heavy, like a man who'd seen one too many ugly truths and was about to add another to the list. "We've been going through everything," he said. "David's operation goes deeper than we thought. He's been using places like that house for years, luring people in, manipulating them. Emily, she's admitted to knowing more than she initially let on." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice tight. Paul hesitated, then sighed. "She knew, Luke. About everything. She wasn't coerced. She wasn't a victim. She chose this." I didn't respond. I couldn't. I sat there holding the phone, trying to process the weight of those words. Paul filled the silence. "She's cooperating with us now, giving us names, dates, locations. She's trying to cut a deal." There was no anger in his voice, just a cold detachment. But for me, the anger was like a fire I couldn't put out. Every detail he shared felt like another blow. Another reminder that the woman I thought I knew didn't exist. The Emily I loved, the Emily I married, was a lie. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of my life. I tried to focus on the kids, to give them some sense of normalcy, but every corner of the house reminded me of her. Her favorite coffee mug still sat in the cabinet. Her books lined the shelves in the living room. Even her scent lingered faintly in the bedroom, a cruel reminder of what I'd lost. I considered leaving it all behind, packing up, moving somewhere new, but the idea felt like running away, and I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. One evening, while the kids were asleep, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the stack of papers Paul had given me. Evidence from the case. Messages, photos, statements from others who'd been involved. I didn't know why I kept looking at them. Maybe I thought I'd find something that would make it all make sense, some piece of the puzzle that would explain why she'd done this. But there was nothing. Just cold, hard facts that painted a picture of a woman I didn't recognize. Eventually, I stopped looking. I packed the papers away in a box, sealed it shut, and shoved it into the back of the closet. I couldn't change what had happened, but I could decide how much power it would have over me. The turning point came when a friend suggested I take the kids and start fresh in a new town. "You need a clean break," he said. "Somewhere quiet. Somewhere she can't touch." The idea scared me, but it also gave me hope. After some searching, I found a small house in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Enough for me and the kids to begin again. The move happened quickly. The kids adjusted better than I expected, their resilience a constant source of inspiration. They made new friends, started at a new school, and slowly, the shadows of the past began to fade. For me, the adjustment was harder. I spent many nights lying awake, the memories of Emily and what she'd done replaying in my mind like a broken record. But each day brought a little more distance, a little more clarity. And slowly, I began to rebuild. Occasionally, I'd hear bits of news about Emily through mutual friends or Paul. She'd managed to avoid jail time by cooperating with the investigation, but her life was far from what it had been. David's operation had collapsed, leaving her without the safety net she'd relied on. Rumors swirled that she was struggling to make ends meet, living in near poverty and working menial jobs to get by. There was a part of me that felt satisfaction in that, but it was fleeting. Mostly, I just felt empty. The woman I'd loved was gone, replaced by a stranger I no longer cared to know. Life in the new town wasn't perfect, but it was better. I met people who didn't know my past, who saw me for who I was now, not who I'd been with her. The kids thrived, their laughter filling the house in a way that made it feel alive again. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. Hope that we could move on. Hope that we could heal. Hope that, one day, the scars Emily left behind would fade into nothing more than a distant memory.